Welcome back to Protecting Our Freedoms podcast, sponsored by the American Security Council Foundation. I'm your host, Joy Vatrovic, and I have American Security Council Foundation Senior Fellow Alan Dowd back again to talk to us about how authoritarian regimes have revived U.S. alliances. Welcome back, Alan.
Good to be here as always, Joy. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And again, Alan, excellent and very timely article. In fact, since the writing of your article, there has been quite a few events. China has made some harsh threats of conflict and confrontation with the U.S. since the spy balloon incident. However, the balloon was also over one of our allies in Canada. And then there's North Korea accusing the U.S. of intentionally aggravating by continual air drills with South Korea. And Putin continues his push into the Ukraine. So there's a lot going on in the world, as you were talking, and our allies certainly are important. So I'd like to talk, Alan, if you could first talk about the importance of our alliance with South Korea and its proximity to these authoritarian regimes.
Sure. Well, as you know, it's kind of interesting. We talked a little bit about Japan's proximity in its tough neighborhood. I think last time or two times ago on your podcast, and obviously all of your listeners know South Korea is in the same neighborhood, so it's a very rough and dangerous neighborhood for these two allies, the Japanese and the Koreans, and basically everything we talked about that applies to Japan holds for the South Koreans too. You have the dagger of North Korea, basically right there at South Korea ends where North Korea begins. The South Korean capital is just a couple dozen miles from that, one of the most armed areas on Earth. North Korea continually testing, and the tempo of it is really picking up missiles. The North Koreans literally don't know where those missiles are going to go, so the South Koreans are on edge, as are the Japanese. And then you have China and Russia encroaching on South Korean and Japanese airspace, sea space. I think it was last year that there was a joint flight of Russian and Chinese aircraft that basically zigzagged in and around and through South Korean and Japanese. What are called ADIZs. Yeah. So these are all things that are impacting South Korea. It's literally the same things that are impacting Japan are impacting South Korea, with one caveat. I mean, let's be honest, South Korea shares the Korean Peninsula with North Korea. It's literally next door, quite literally right bordered by the threat that is the North Korean regime. Japan has a little bit of buffer space thanks to the Sea of Japan, but it's a very small amount of buffer space in an era of missiles. Right. But it's the same dangerous neighborhood that the Japanese are in. What's interesting, and we're trying, and several administrations have tried, as you know, Joy, and I'm sure some of the listeners maybe have even been part of the efforts, and on the military side, the Japanese and South Koreans don't, at least up until the last couple of years, they don't cooperate as much as one would expect them to, given the nature of the threats around them. But that's changing, and that's a good thing. New leadership in both Tokyo and Seoul over the last couple of years has helped them move closer together, and then also just the nature of the threats, I think, has helped them in the United States, trying to be a bridge builder to these two allies. I think that's helping them work together more, but they need to work together to secure and to deter their common enemies.
Absolutely. And I think that North Korea is not happy, obviously, with our drills that we're performing with South Korea at the present moment.
Right. And those have, we, the South Korea U.S. side, the ROK U.S. side, have tried to modulate or even dial down those drills at times, different administrations from both parties in a sign of goodwill. And that has been received, like with a slap at the hand, So it only makes sense to return to robust deterrence drills and that promote interoperability, that promote joint training, joint planning, and joint operations, and that's what the U.S. RRK force is doing, and I think it's the right thing to do. It's the South Korean Army is a very formidable army, and together with the U.S., enablers or maximizers, the things that the U.S. can help the South Koreans with, should be enough to deter the North. I've said before, the classes I teach, it's one of the only places on Earth, and maybe the only place in American foreign policy where we measure success in a very different way than anywhere else. At the Korean Peninsula, we measure success, we as a country, we as administrations, we as the National Command Authority or a military. Did we get through this day and this week without another war? That's the measure of success. That's the low bar, but that's how dangerous it is there, how dangerous it's been since 1953. And that's the way we measure success. And until that regime changes in the North, that's the way it's going to be.
Speaking and leading into that, actually, I was surprised that the threats were coming from Kim's sister, not him himself. Do you think this could indicate a possible regime change in the future?
I don't know. He's young, I don't. And he doesn't look the picture of health.
No, right.
His grandfather lived longer than his father, but I don't know. I truly don't know if she would be the heir apparent, or if it would pass to his another generation, his daughter, I guess, who's pretty young. But it's a very close society. It's all about interpretation of tea leaves and signals and things, and there are experts inside the CIA and DIA who try to interpret, and I'm sure inside the South Korean equivalents, try to interpret what those messages mean. The fact that, like you said, Joy, they're being conveyed by a sister rather than the main leader. Your guess literally is as good as mine. In my case, it just would be a guess. It's hard to understand to me why she would be conveying these threatening messages. But he does, he also has seen, at missile drills, and he's made himself seen in public. So it's not like he's disappeared or anything. Right.
It was just an interesting notice.
Absolutely.
So tensions with China are rising as well since the spy balloon incident, and China is now very much threatening confrontation with the U.S. 2 days ago, an article I read in the Wall Street Journal stated that the U.S. is not ready for a great power conflict.
Right.
We've talked numerous times about the need to increase our military spending and build up our military, not just, I would guess, hardware-wise, but also cyber-wise.
Right.
However, in speaking with alliances, do you think the U.S. could prevent a conflict with China by our allies by standing with our allies and calling out China's disregard for the international rules-based order?
Could you restate that? I didn't hear the end of that. Cut out.
Sorry about that.
No, it's okay.
Do you think the U.S., with not regards to our spending, because we know where we're at with that, we've talked about it numerous times, but with regards to our allies, do you think we could deter a conflict with China by standing and calling out China's disregard for the international rules-based order?
It's a good question. It's the $64 million question in the 21st century, or in the case of, it's a great question. And one way to look at it, Joy, is yes, we're doing that. We are definitively deterring the Chinese from doing something they want to do, which is to take Taiwan. So we have successfully done that yet another day, to use a reference I just made to the North Korea, South Korea situation. So in one sense, yes. But then when you read that our CIA director says that we have intelligence that says Xi has ordered his lieutenants to be ready to take Taiwan by 2027. And then when we hear General Minahan, who you talked about last month, I guess, say, my gut tells me we're going to have to defend Taiwan with military force by 2025, then you wonder really, are we deterring them, or are they just building up and buying the time so they can attack at a time of their choosing? So I'm not trying to be coy or play both sides of the coin. I think in one sense we're deterring them, we're giving them pause. In another sense, I don't think it's your premise I would agree with. I don't think it's the level of deterrence, the level of capabilities that ensures Taiwan's security and the security of Japan's southern islands, the security of Philippine islands. These are treaty allies, the Philippines and
right.
Japan, as you know. Taiwan is not. But the loss of, I always remind people that the loss of Taiwan from the free world, the absorption of Taiwan by the PRC would be a crushing blow to the free world. And it would be a serious blow to the alliance system that America built in the Indo-Pacific that we began building after World War II. Because our allies there would say, is America able to defend its interests and its friends in this region? What would they do? Well, they probably would start going their own way. Some might make a separate peace with China. Others might go down the nuclear path to say that's the only thing that will give China pause. It would be not just the loss of life and liberty to Taiwan, which is important and crucial. It'd be the loss of a whole bunch of alliance systems and the kind of security buffers that the United States has. Not to mention, you talked about this at length, Joy. Taiwan is the world's biggest producer of semiconductor chips. That China absorbs that. That would really give them the strong hand or the ace card in the world's in what really is kind of the lifeblood of the 21st century. So I think it's. More needs to be done to deter China. I think that's why, like General Minahan's memo was leaked. That was a private memo. Someone leaked it. I don't know if it was the general himself or one of the staff. Those kinds of things. I think it's why the CIA director's comments were shared. That it's awakening the policymakers to what the military needs. Things like you mentioned, the balloon incident. That the things like that are awakening the average American to the real nature of the Chinese regime.
Absolutely.
A friendly government does not do that, right? A friendly government does not do that, right? So, and they're not a friendly government. I've monopolized their time here. I'll throw it back over to you in a second, but I just remind people that Cold War II, or Cold War 2.0, as I call it, is preferable to the alternative. And we, the United States, we, the Western world, we, the free world, we are not trying to create or manufacture a new enemy. China is acting like an enemy, from its commercial and trade policies to its treatment of its own citizens, which is an issue of ideals for the American people, to its military buildup. It's unprecedented, to the things it's doing with its military, to its, you mentioned cyber a minute ago. Some people say it's as much as 600 billion with a B, lost creativity, entrepreneurship that is being siphoned away by Chinese cyber attacks every year from the United States. It acts like an enemy. And so if it acts like an enemy, we have to treat it that way.
Yes, and yet they're the ones threatening us to step down. So, but I do think, as you said, the spy balloon incident has brought this to the front of Americans' minds and understanding what China is doing. And in my discussion with our senior analyst, Lawrence Sanford, yesterday, we were talking about land grabs here in the U.S. and how our U.S. citizens are fighting now against this and against China being so close to our military bases. So I think there was definitely an awakening here in America of the CCP's intentions.
That's right. And awakening is a great term, Joy. And it's happening across the board. It's happening at the state level. It's happening on both sides of the political aisle, which is great. Senator Cornyn said the other day, there's very few things that unite or bridge the divide in D.C. He said, but one of them is China. And, you used a great term, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, CCP. It's the regime that's the problem. It's not the Chinese people. It's the regime. It's that system that's the problem. And we, the House voted, this bitterly divided House and this bitterly divided D.C. and this bitterly divided country voted, I think it was 365 to 60 to vote to create a special select committee on the CCP and its threat to the United States. That's an impressive display of unity.
Yes.
and awakening. I love your term, Joy, awakening to the nature of the threat that we're facing. Again, it's not fabricated. We're not trying to find a boogeyman. It's China is behaving a certain way, the CCP regime, and we are reacting to that.
Yes, and I mean, I know your article is about our alliances across the globe, basically, but really it seems to be bringing an alliance here in America as well.
Yes, that's right. Security begins at home, and there has to be a foreign policy consensus. As you know, Joy, and I think most of our listeners know, no foreign policy that is going to be long enduring or needs to be long will make it, will succeed if there's not a broad consensus of the American people behind it. It just won't work. It won't last. So if you need it to be if it's like the Cold War, this is going to be a long effort. We want to keep it cold. The alternative is unthinkable. So you got to have a lot of buy-in, a lot of commitment across the board, the broad populace of the American people, and I think that's emerging. And I think that's a good thing. You and I are too young to remember firsthand, but we've studied it. The Sputnik moment really awoke America, the average American to the Soviet threat. The balloon, in a similar way, could be kind of like a Sputnik moment, awakening the average American to the nature of the threat. Sputnik was not a missile that was launched against us. It was a rocket that had no direct or warlike effect on the United States. It was a satellite, but it awoke the American people to the dangers of the Soviets beating us in any number of areas. And I think maybe the balloon could be something akin to that for the average American.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And then we found, you mentioned it went over Canada. There are also balloons that were found over Colombia. So several allied countries are dealing with this. And now we're trying to get information from allies in Europe, allies in the Indo-Pacific about, have you encountered things like this? And I would suspect it's happened quite a bit more than just these 3 or 4 incidents that we've talked about the last month. That's
a good point. I'm curious to hear back from them on that as well. But yes, I was going to bring up Latin America and the spy balloon being down over those countries, Colombia and Costa Rica, I think Venezuela as well, Nicaragua. Mm-hmm. I mean, some of them are very socialist leaning at this time, but maybe this is an awakening for them too. Hopefully. That's right, and you hope so. That's what you hope. It certainly does seem, by the way, I like what you said, that there's been the emergence of an American political alliance. And then it looks like our allies in Europe are opening their eyes to the threat posed by China. India, over in the Indo-Pacific, as you talked, Joy, and you and I've talked over the last few months, they've been way ahead on this one. The Japanese, the Australians, the Indians, they see what China's doing, and they're a step ahead of the Europeans, and I think even of us. On the China threat. But now the Europeans are awakening to this, and you're hearing strong words from the Chancellor of Germany and other leaders over there in Europe, and then Britain too. And I think that's nothing but good, Yes, and we were discussing yesterday, I know lately in the news, they've been talking about the Chinese cranes posing a possible threat in cyber spyware situations, and we know the Greek port of Pyrenees, I believe it's called, the Chinese have a heavy presence there and of their cranes as well, and this goes right into the heart of Europe, so definitely our allies there need to pay attention.
Absolutely. That's one thing that you and I have talked about offline, and I know I've written about it for American Security Council, this buying up of strategically located ports all around the world. The Chinese have done that over the last decade, 15 years, and that's a real security vulnerability that the United States has been warning, especially the Europeans, about It's not just what they call the string of pearls around the South Asia basin, but it's all the way up into, like you mentioned, ports in Europe. And I think the Europeans are waking up to that. The strings that come with Chinese management of these ports are dangerous and really do open them up to vulnerabilities and open up the entire free world to vulnerability too.
Yes. And maybe possible more alliances we'll see in the future here. But one other question, Alan, as I was reading about some of these articles, specifically the Philippines, which was actually very encouraging in that they wanted to bring to light what the Chinese are doing there in the South China Sea, especially with the laser beam situation, and hoping that other countries will wake up to that. But in doing so, I'm sorry, our phone is ringing here, I apologize. In doing so, they said they are putting less effort into some of the terrorist actions in their country. And the Wall Street Journal article that I read 2 days ago, I just mentioned, also said they were kind of I won't say turning away completely, but putting more energy into these aggressive authoritarian regimes because they're taking much of our effort of China, the Russia-Ukraine incident, and Iran and North Korea. By putting all these energies into that, are we risking losing ground on terrorist groups like ISIS?
Right. The thing about the Philippines, President Marcos, the new Marcos, seems to be very much a hard-nosed, realistic, fair-minded leader, and he kind of has thankfully walked away from Duterte's soft brand of authoritarianism and become certainly more democratic, small d leader, which is good. He said very openly, and the Wall Street Journal kind of featured it, we have to now focus on the big threat, which is China. And China is literally threatening our sovereignty. It's claiming islands or occupying islands, and it wants more, so we have to reorient our security from, like you said, these terrorist groups and these that are on the dozens and dozens of Philippine islands there in the southern part of the archipelago. We have to reorient it. And so what I say to that, Joy, you're correct. It is basically this or that. The Philippines doesn't have the resources to do everything. I always remind people America doesn't have the resources to do everything, and we have a lot of resources. Yes. But you have to, governing policy making is about choices, and he is concluding that it's more the bigger threat is China, and that should speak volumes to us. Yes. For the Philippines, because you're right, they've been fighting terrorist groups that are linked to international jihadist groups for decades. We've been helping them in that fight, as you know. But they're saying we have to pivot, reorient it, focus most of our defense resources on the China threat. That's, by the way, opening up doors to U.S. Access to return to the Philippines in ways we haven't been in a while, which I think is good to have presence there. But I do think you're right. The reality is, as countries focus and shift resources to that threat, it's just a matter of fact that the Islamist jihadist threat is not going to be dealt with in the same way or with the same intensity. Yeah. By the way, the Biden administration basically said that in maybe in less direct words, but the withdrawal from Afghanistan was partly couched in we got to devote resources to the China threat. And Afghanistan was the very heart of the jihadist threat to the United States and the Western world. And I suspect it is again, but it wasn't when the United States was working with a democratic Afghan government to fight them. Now we're not doing that. So the Philippines basically are just in a sense, Joyce, saying what our administration said 2 years ago.
And that's understandable. We have to pivot to the other threats that are really facing us. And not that I necessarily agree with the way we pulled out of Afghanistan, but I understand the necessities of pivoting.
That's the great distinction you make, and so few people are able to make that distinction. But as usual, make a thoughtful distinction. Maybe it's correct to withdraw from Afghanistan, but how you do it matters. And there's a strong argument to be made by a lot of active duty military personnel and commanders that we shouldn't have withdrawn from Afghanistan at all. But if you're going to make the argument that we should, no one thinks we should have done it the way we did it. In that sense, that had a cascading impact. There's no doubt it had an impact on Vladimir Putin's timetable in Ukraine. He was going to go after Ukraine again. I always remind people again, because he went after Ukraine in 2014, and then he paused, and now in 2022 he did it again. But I think that if his timetable was affected by the pullout from Afghanistan and how we did it.
Yes. And I know some people have suggested that we should have kept some intel there on the ground in Afghanistan, which I actually thought was a pretty good plan. But we'll see how things go in the future. And I think that our allies are certainly important, and I'm glad that they are with us on this and awakening to China's threats to the international law order we have, as well as Russia and the Ukraine situation, and Iran backing Russia with drones, and China possibly going to as well.
Right. That's right. It's a, whether or not there's a formal treaty binding them is kind of irrelevant. They are working in concert, these authoritarian regimes. Mm-hmm. And the Iranians are offering and delivering kamikaze drones. The Russians are returning the favor by delivering, it looks like, new air defense systems to Iran. Who knows if or how much they'll help them cross the finish line on a nuclear weapon. The Chinese have sent non-lethal drones to Russia. We know that. They say that they might send lethal hardware to Russia. No matter what they do hardware-wise, Joy, they've already basically floated or helped the Russian economy stay up by buying a lot of Russian energy resources. We now know that there are Afghan fighters that the Russians have recruited to fight alongside them in Ukraine. So that's another part of this authoritarian, what I call axis, that is working together as the world redivides. It really isn't new, but it's coming back, a division between authoritarian and democratic regimes.
Yes, that was excellent insight into that, Alan. And what you said, too, as far as even if there's not a contract between them, if China starts threatening us and more aggressively, it seems like North Korea is now following in suit. So, right.
And I do think that in the case of North Korea and China, by the way, I do think China basically uses North Korea like a puppet on a string sometimes to distract the West, to divert attention. And China has the ability and the capacity to bring North Korea to heel, and it never really has. And that's, I often call North Korea China's Frankenstein monster. It really, it could do a lot more. It doesn't. And the reason it doesn't is it knows it diverts resources and attention of the America and its allies.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that in your article, which for our viewers you can find on our website at www.ascf.us. And we look forward to the second part of this, because I don't want to get too far into how we're going to counter this, because I know you're going to write a little bit about that coming up next month. So we look forward to your next article, Alan. And as always, I appreciate you coming on and talking about these serious issues to our listeners.
Glad to do it. Thanks for having me.
And thank you, listeners, for coming on board to Protecting Our Freedoms. We encourage you to read Alan's articles at www.ascf.us. Please subscribe to our newsletter, as you'll receive all of Alan's updates, his articles that come out, as well as other articles and podcasts. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and subscribe to our YouTube channel and Rumble at American Security Council Foundation. Thank you again, Alan.
Thank you, Joy.
And to our listeners, please join us again next time as we bring you the stories on protecting our freedoms.